I'm absolutely delighted once again to be joined by Joe Lindsley, a traveler and writer and American reporting on Chicago's WGN radio from Ukraine each and every weekday of Russia's full-scale war. Indeed, he's the only Western correspondent to have done so since this kicked off nearly 3 years ago. Joe was once protégé to Fox News founder Roger Ailes, but escaped the frenzied world where power mattered more than truth. But his connections to that world of conservative media is now a priceless asset for Ukraine as we embark upon the trauma and chaos of a second Trump term in office. Welcome to Slick Curtain. Please, I know you'll want to put a like against this video when you've seen it. Check that you are subscribed. There's weird stuff going on with algorithms across all sorts of platforms, so do make sure you haven't been automatically unsubscribed, and it will help you to find the fantastic new speakers that we feature. Thank you also to anybody who has supported the channel through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, and also thank you to everyone who is supporting the documentary film campaign that we're currently running. There are more details about that in the description of the video. For now, though, Joe, welcome back to the channel.
Jonathan, great to speak with you. And I know we were delayed here because I took a small nap and I'm exhausted because we've had really for the past 10 days, 10 or 12 days, sustained and regular Russian drone attacks upon Kyiv city, from which I speak to you here in Kyiv. And 2 days ago, we expected this massive attack. 24 bombers had taken off. Nothing happened on that particular day. But then this morning, we had a pretty intense missile and drone attack upon the city. And, even something I've never really felt here before in Kyiv, but almost 2 minutes of sustained machine gun fire as a counterattack to the incoming drones. It was a foggy day. And the Russians also have these new drones that are smaller and quieter and harder to shoot down. And so pretty sleepless nights and intense mornings here. But I'm glad to speak to you now on this evening here in Kyiv.
It's good, and of course, we're speaking at I think an extraordinary active time. We probably can't speak too much about the policies of the incoming administration because we don't know what those are yet. We're starting to see Trump's cabinet, as it were, or ministers or whatever it's called in the US. I've lost my word there. But the secretaries of state are starting to be sort of selected. Of course, they have to go through a process of being confirmed. It's highly likely that not all of them will be necessarily ratified or confirmed on the first round. And it's looking quite interesting, isn't it? There's some people who look like they are, relatively speaking, adults, as it were, people who are open to evidence and reason, and people who, they may have said some stuff which is very much aligned with their political views, but there are quite a number of his picks that have not repeated Russian talking points or Russian narratives. And that's certainly interesting. There are a few figures clearly who are down a very deep rabbit hole and who do have a habit of sort of amplifying Russian narratives. So it's turning into a bit of a curious mixed bag, isn't it? Is this what you expected, or is there any surprises in there for you?
Oh, well, life is full of surprises, especially in war. But I would say the first thing that been a huge misrepresentation in almost all media about the mood in Kyiv since the election of Trump. And I was here on election day, and actually the next day there was a new brightness in Kyiv with the election of Trump. And this does not mean there was jubilation in the streets. And I think it might be hard initially for a lot of people to understand this, including people who really support Ukraine. But walking around Kyiv on Wednesday after the American election, and this was widespread and regular conversations among many Ukrainians that at least with Trump, there was a chance. There's a chance for a clear yes or a clear no, rather than living this like sort of eternal maybe, as long as it takes, as Joe Biden often says. And I think what that shows, firstly, is the depths of the darkness and depression that Ukrainians were feeling the past months. And I've been reporting on that. I speak every single day in Chicago, WGN radio. And if you listen to it, probably people could hear it in my voice even, because I'm immersed here, and I sort of reflected the mood of the people here. But this growing sense that, like, from Washington and the Biden administration policy of constantly restricting Ukraine. Even Ukraine goes to incredible lengths to open windows of opportunity, such as that incursion into Kursk region of Russia. The first time there's been a forward army on Russian soil since World War II, and there's not even a congratulatory note. Everything is negative and what Ukraine can't do. And it was very clear for Ukrainians that with the current policy, that it's just going to be a long, slow bleed. And you have, in fact, one way to look at the mood, Kyiv city, 30 miles from Russia. The Russians have been bombing that very intensely. In fact, they've even brazenly began to hit the most beautiful and important cultural icons of that city, which they had previously. Russia has tried to avoid hitting sort of the most precious cultural icons of Ukraine, in the same way that Hitler, didn't want to destroy Paris because they want it for themselves. And the Russians they hit the Prom building, for example, this constructivist building from 1928. That's really the main icon of Kyiv. The Russians have now hit it twice in the past month, and so there's this increasing sense of attacks. And the last time that happened was in May. The Russians were pounding Kyiv, but morale was high in May, and morale is lowered now with slightly less intensity of attacks, because you also have a situation where you have the recruitment, military recruitment teams are rounding people up in the streets, and that's creating it hurts the morale here, but it's out of necessity. It's because things have not been looking good, and with the current policy from Washington, there was very little hope that Ukraine could win with any help from America. And so the election of Trump, and there's so many people said to me, from policy people to baristas and everyone you would speak to in Kyiv, at least now we have a chance to try something different and new. We can get a clear yes or a clear no. And so while the mood, I saw, Fareed Zakaria and Martha Raddatz and all the top American pundits and reporters were saying last Wednesday, oh, everyone in Kyiv must be gnashing their teeth today, the day after the election. That was not the case. There was a new energy and very much a sense for Ukrainians. Okay, now we have to really make our case to try to get support in this new administration. Mm-hmm. And I think you see, in the court of Mar-a-Lago, that there's a lot of maneuvering happening now. I think at the official level, the Ukraine is a bit absent. We can go into details on that later, but a bit absent from these conversations. But you sort of people who support Ukraine are working to be of influence there. And one positive sign, if you talk to people who support Ukraine, one of the people who they have the highest or the least regard for is Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor to Joe Biden. And there's a sense that he's been, the architect of this policy of sort of the maximum of the minimum of support. And when President Trump announced the other day his pick for National Security Advisor, Congressman Mike Waltz, not Tim Walz, Mike Waltz from Florida, there's a bit of a hope here, because Mike Waltz in 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion, was a strong voice, like many were at that time, in favor of Ukraine. And so he said the only way to respond to Russia is with a wall of steel. But over time, and his tune changed in his voting patterns. And for example, so he voted against the spending package, support package for Ukraine last spring. But if you look closely at it, his reasons for voting against it were not against Ukraine. It was more a frustration with the Biden administration for not choosing to be effective. And on several occasions, Mike Waltz, so again, who's Trump's pick to be National Security Advisor, has said, we're giving Ukraine lots of weapons. We need to give Ukraine more sophisticated weapons. And the other big thing that he's been saying is, we can say we support Ukraine all we want, but if we continue to let Russia profit from oil, then there's no way this is never going to end. It's a fantasy to think it's going to end. And Mike Waltz actually called Russia a gas station with nukes, and he said that we have to get serious about enforcing the sanctions. And this gets to a very under discussed topic. In fact, Jonathan, there's been so few articles about this. The only one I can think of is a story in Bloomberg from over a year ago, and then a smattering here and there. The Biden administration, the Treasury Department of the Biden administration, continues to give sanctions waivers to 17 Russian banks precisely because they facilitate oil transactions. And countries like India, India has now become the biggest importer of Russian gas, and India refines it and then sells it to Europe. And so even alleged allies of Ukraine, like Czechia, Czech Republic, which gives a lot of especially ammunition support to Ukraine, well, they actually have given more money to Russia via India and other countries for oil and gas than they have given support to Ukraine. And so the fact that Trump would pick someone who actually sees this and is sharp on this point is a hopeful sign for Ukrainians.
And that's interesting because I've been putting together an episode for the channel, which is looking at 10 ways, or the top 10 ways in which Trump, if he chose to, or perhaps he may do this unconsciously, could completely screw Russia up. And the realization came during the preparation of this is that these levers have been in place all along. These levers could have been pulled at any time. And several of them combined, all of them combined, would bring Russia down. Would bring its war to an end, would result in Russian defeat and them being ejected from Ukraine. I have no doubt, even in Ukraine's attrited and weakened state as it is 3 years into the war, if all these levers were pulled, Russia would be over in terms of this. It would have to concentrate on its internal problems and chaos. Not only would it not be in a position to attack Ukraine, it would not be in a position to attack other countries too, whether that be in Central Asia or other places that it could potentially move its war machine onto if the conflict in Ukraine was frozen or ended in a defeat. That then gives the realization that, is it that the Biden administration were not aware of these levers? No. Things you say there and other things other experts have spoken to certainly suggest that they are acutely aware of all these levers and their impact, but have chosen not to use them, not to pull them. Adding one in there, which almost never gets talked about, is Rosatom. How is Rosatom not sanctioned? A huge earner for the Russian government. And we can point to all these different institutions, international institutions, etc. They don't actually amount to an awful lot for Russia, except there's something for it to, pervert and tweak and manipulate. But the International Atomic Energy organizations are real because they involve real influence, real pressure that can be exerted on, adversaries and client states alike, and a huge earner for Russia. It's quite clear that these levers have been demonstrably not pulled. And I'll come to the point here as well, because people know on the channel, I'm certainly not a fan of Trump, the individual, and I'm not someone who comes from the sort of GOP type world. In the UK, I'm not someone who comes from conservative politics either. But it seems to me that people who are inclined to be partisan supporters of the Democrats point to the immorality of Trump's foreign policy. And yet the Democrats, I think, have chosen not to pull these levers because they fear that higher oil prices, etc., would lose them the election. So domestic political advantage has entirely skewed these foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, I see that. And I think, there was a sense, and I felt it keenly here in just reporting as I do every day, and including one of the things I have to report is there was the frustration of Ukrainians at Washington. And every time I say that, we have to keep in mind the historical aspect of it. I mean, it was, Democrats and Republicans in Washington since 1991 have worked to de-arm this country, especially every time there's been a revolution. They've They've tried to, they've actually successfully got Ukraine to give up its best weapons, and including Joe Biden. And every time I would just simply report on my daily segment on WGN Radio, the Ukrainians are frustrated. In the lead up to the election, sort of people who were very partisan in favor of Biden would get mad at me and say, "How dare you? Because don't criticize, because we at least we can criticize later, but we got to get him elected, and because it's going to be better for Ukraine." And in Ukraine, that there was really there was no sense of that because there was the policy of Joe Biden it's not good. There's no sign that it's going to get better. It's sad and tragic, I think. And I think this is so. Here's where those who support Ukraine and those who support the idea of freedom and decency around the world have a chance to make a case to the forming Trump administration. I mean, for example, look, Trump has named Elon Musk as someone he wants him to be part of his administration to reform government, to get rid of inefficiency in government. Well, the best example of corruption and inefficiency and hypocrisy is the way Ukraine has been treated. For example, Washington says, "Oh, we'll give billions and billions to Ukraine," but then they actually won't give Ukraine permission to use that well. And it's a typical formula of Washington saying, if we spend money, we'll solve the problem, and hopefully we kick it down the road for a while. This is bipartisan in Washington. This is what they typically do. And here, Ukraine is exposing that as a dangerous and horrible policy. Even, for example, and I think they do it really without thinking. And so that's why if you get someone like Elon Musk on this, maybe there is a chance to try to begin to reform it. And a couple ways to look at it. One, for example, a few weeks ago, I was at the secret defense conference, defense tech conference here in Kyiv. It had to be secret, so everyone didn't get blown up. And I encountered Ukrainians that make, for example, a robot used at the front lines, which they can sell for about $50,000 US. So in a way that still sustains the whole team and the research and development. The same type of product created in the United States is sold to the Defense Department for $450,000. So $50,000 here, $450,000 to the Defense Department, and the products made in America are not tested in battle. And as we see here, they're actually not good for modern warfare. They're untested, and when they are tested, they prove to be they don't live up to the right standard. And so Ukrainians are actually embarrassing the American defense industry, and that's one reason why they want to keep that story under wraps, because what Ukrainians are able to do in their garages is a threat to the entire American defense industry. And if someone like Elon Musk is really serious about cleaning up the bloated corruption in Washington, Ukraine actually shows you very clearly where these problems are and how to get around it. And so I think that's, and then when we think about in the budget, for example, and I think Jonathan, this has been one of the most sinister things, the way Washington talks about spending for Ukraine. So both the way the White House talks about it and the way the opposition responds to it. We had the $60 billion spending package that was finally passed after months of nothing in April. And so fast forward and then last September, when southeastern United States is getting hit by hurricanes, the Biden administration announces they're giving $8 billion in support to Ukraine. And that was the headline, and that was every story. And you're, including me reading it, I had to investigate and say, wait, is this a new $8 billion? No, it was part of that $60 billion that Congress had approved in April. And the Biden administration was extremely reluctant to send that support. And, it's not even cash, by the way. It's a valuation of support. It's a valuation of old weapons. Biden could have given that in June, but delayed it until September, but doesn't explain that this is actually what Congress had already approved, because in the mentality of Washington, saying you spend money makes you look like a hero. In the old mentality of Washington, saying you're spending money makes you feel, makes you think that the people will respect you for that. I think we're seeing that the mood is changing on that in America, but that had a very sinister effect. Imagine, people, thinking, not even people who were directly affected by the hurricanes, but people who, saw what was happening with the damage of the hurricanes, and they hear Washington at that very moment say, we're giving Ukraine $8 billion. And for them, they're adding that 8 billion in their minds to the 60 billion that was approved, even though it was a part of that 60 billion. No one explained it. And so no wonder people, when they hear Ukraine, when they're frustrated in America with all the different problems, no wonder they say, no, we're tired of this. And so it's just simple dishonesty about spending. I think that really has hurt Ukraine. And if the new Trump administration is serious about it, well, now's the time to fix it. And Ukraine is the way to, is like the vanguard of the possibilities of introducing some honesty into our conversations in Washington.
I think serious is the word there, isn't it? Because it's probably not the case that that was done maliciously, but it does sound like it's on autopilot, like it's an autopilot political PR spin machine that's sort of just doing its thing, not really thinking about the consequences. That also tells us something. It means that Ukraine's not a priority, because if they were really, really worried about the optics, if they were really concerned about getting a result in Ukraine, they'd have paid attention. They would have said, hang on a second, let's not put it out that way. Let's do it a different way. Let's do something else. It just sounds to me all the way through that Ukraine has not been a top priority. And in fact, I had an interview with Ben Hodges in 2022, late 2022, the first one with him. Even at that stage, we were starting to, I think, understand what I now call the Sullivan Doctrine, which is the idea that you micromanage everything, that you need to know where every single bullet's going to end up. You have to have that total administrative accountability to everything. Plus, we hadn't at that point seen any red lines because we were pretty early on and a lot of these more powerful systems hadn't been given. But as things unfolded, I think it became clearer and clearer and clearer. What for most Ukrainians, well, I'll ask this question because I know we're going to talk about, what the breaking point was, because we've been talking about escalation management, Sullivan, on the channel since autumn 23, around the time of the ammunition famine. It became clear that the problems in Congress were not the only things going on, that we actually had, the US administration holding or tying Ukraine's hands behind its backs, pushing it into a full-scale counteroffensive without giving it the equipment that was required to actually achieve that. So that was sort of starting to sort of become apparent then. But there are events this year where I think people have really started to understand that if Sullivan carried on in that role, it would inevitably result in a long, slow, painful attritional defeat for Ukraine. What was the point at which you detected people really starting to sort of build that sort of put the last pieces of the jigsaw together in their minds?
Well, I think if we had to pinpoint it, I mean, it's different for everyone, but in the zeitgeist effect was the July 8th Russian missile attack, a very targeted, intense attack that hit the main children's hospital in Ukraine, here in Kyiv, and that was on the eve of the NATO summit. And a lot of Ukrainians said, okay, this is going to at least galvanize NATO to really stand up to Russia. And it had the opposite effect. It probably made, if anything, it made Western leaders more afraid of Russia. And from that moment, you like if you're, and I was not surprised by this, because as I was telling Ukrainians, if you're not already moved by what the Russians did in Mariupol in the spring of 2022, some new atrocity is not going to move you. And I think Ukrainians, with the attack on the children's hospital, they realize that. They realize, okay, more disasters are not going to help us. What we need are stories that we can survive and win. On the idea of Jake Sullivan as a micromanager, I don't think they're micromanagers. I think that they're the very philosophical level of things, and avoiding the consequences of their ideas and avoiding looking at the details. And here's why there's a hope. For example, in Trump's selection for his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, when Congress was debating the aid package for Ukraine in the spring, Mike Waltz had this very powerful statement that went viral. He had a bag of electrical bolts of bushings that should be about $100, and as he said, the Defense Department spends $90,000 for that little plastic bag. 90, that, this is the usual shenanigans, right? And he's like, no more of this. And so, and that was the mood of the people, many people in America, is like, they're tired of hearing, after 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan, they're tired of hearing Washington talk about war. And so Ukraine gets sort of the blame for this. But here's where I think someone like Mike Waltz does see it. It's like, it's not Ukraine's fault. It's the fault of the bureaucrats in Washington who really don't, it's Marie Antoinette mentality. And I think we even saw this in, and this is a warning for Ukrainian leaders too. We saw this in the campaign, I think, of Kamala Harris, and I think this is why she wasn't able to ultimately to get the win. I was meeting with people in Ukraine a month ago, some political people, and I put on a piece of paper the podcast that Donald Trump was going on and the podcast that Kamala Harris was going on. And Kamala Harris went on about 2 or 3 sort of popular podcasts, but still kind of, fringe, not sort of mainstream, not people in swing states. And Trump went on more than a dozen podcasts that, any red-blooded American who's driving trucks or, working in factories, or American veterans, people throughout all the country know these shows. And Trump went on almost all the most popular shows on podcasts in America, things that people at CNN and ABC, they don't even know this exists. And I showed to the Ukrainian politicians, I said, because you could easily see Kamala went on like 2 or 3 shows, and Trump went on like more than a dozen, including Joe Rogan, which has he's got a bigger audience than almost every single individual network in America. And the elites like to dismiss it. But I said to the Ukrainians, I said, this is going to show you who's going to win the election. The person who's talking to the people, who understands the people. And I said, the important lesson for Ukraine needs to have voices on the same shows. Ukraine needs to run the campaign for Ukraine like an old-fashioned American presidential election, and you got to be out there making the case. You can't just be in the elite circles. You have to be speaking to the people. And the good thing is, Ukraine, if we could open these floodgates, Ukrainian people are so, they fight for faith, family, freedom. They're exactly the people that middle America would love and adore if they actually got to hear the voices of Ukrainians. And so I think this, but this elite idea that looking down upon the people, that did not serve the Harris campaign well. And I think this is the same. It's the same mentality that's dismissive of Ukraine. Ukrainians, and this is the mentality that's pushing for Ukraine to negotiate. That okay, we're proud of you guys. You did it. You're really, really inspiring. But do you really need to be that free? Can't you just make some deals? And we've had enough of this. And that is an elite mentality. It's going back to what the Polish foreign minister now in 2014, Sikorski said to the Ukrainian protesters in the Maidan, in the main square. He said, the Western so American conservatives, so-called like Tucker Carlson, they try to think that they try to say the Maidan revolution was created by the CIA and all this. No, Washington and Brussels and Berlin and Paris tried to control the protesters in Ukraine in the Maidan, and they got a deal with Yanukovych. And the Ukrainian people said, no, we don't want that. We're sick of the Soviet yoke, of Moscow yoke, of anyone's yoke. And the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski, who's now once again the Polish foreign minister, he said, if you don't agree to this deal, you're all going to die. And the people in the streets of Kyiv said, no, we don't care. We resisted. And in a strange way, his statement was prescient, because now we're facing ballistic missiles there every day. But that still is this. I don't think that the elites, and this is on the Republican and Democratic side, really understand an actual devotion to the idea of freedom. And that's really what the Ukrainians have. And I think that's what most people around the world want. And that's what we saw. I think that's what we saw in the American election. People said, they don't want, they're tired of being governed by elites who seem out of touch. And that's why the words of Mike Waltz resonated when he's got a little bag of bolts that should be $100 and it's $90,000, and that's nothing for Washington. Ukraine, and here's the message I think to Elon and others: Ukraine is what shows that that we don't have to keep living this way. Ukrainians do this with their ingenuity, with much, they don't have the bloated budgets of the DoD in America, and they're still holding on 2.5 years into this. I think Ukrainians show all this possibility.
It's a complex picture, though, isn't it? Because what Ukraine also thinks shows us is that if you can align with that popular sentiment, and if you can say that, yes, you're going to actually fix the system, you're going to drain the swamp, you're going to tackle oligarchy, you're going to tackle corruption, that's great. Okay, we'll give you a chance to do that. But if you don't do that, in Ukraine, they hold people to account. If you don't go on and do what you say, then you've got another Maidan on your hands. I think this is going to be interesting. This is going to be the real test of American democracy, certainly, is whether people are going to choose the sound bites, but not have the political culture, not have the energy and determinism to actually follow up and then hold those leaders to account. There are, of course, many people on the other side that say, well, hang on a second, Musk is not a Democrat. He doesn't do an awful lot that demonstrate he understands anything about the democratic process. He's been incredibly effective at milking the US system for grants for his various companies. Huge amounts of money he's taken out of the system. Yes, he's created some extraordinary ventures and engineering, but I don't want to focus on him until he's proven right or wrong. But that's going to be the real test, isn't it? In 4 years' time, if these big promises come to nothing, if this is just another set of grifters, another set of mosquitoes landing to get their stomach filled with blood, is the American political culture sophisticated and healthy enough to hold them to account? Or are people going to stick to their partisan corners? That's going to be the real test, isn't it? Because I know a lot of people watching this are going to be like, hang on a second, are we talking about the same Musk? Are we talking about the same people here? We're looking at the rise of oligarchy, something which actually Ukrainians and Maidan have decided they don't want anything to do. They don't want rich guys owning their media platforms. They don't want rich guys dictating their, to their legislatures and imposing their vision of the future when actually it should be something that emerges from a far more democratic process. I don't want to sort of condemn the government because they haven't taken office yet. But do you think that's an interesting point that if they fail to deliver, are they going to get held to account?
Yeah, well, I would say I think that for all my Celtic pessimism, I am also American, and I believe in our constitutional system. I think there's a lot of wisdom to it, and I think the American people, they have a good sense about things. I believe democracy is possible, and I think holding to account is exactly what we saw with this election. Just take the case of Ukraine. Like the Biden administration thought, in the old ways of Washington, that you can, live very comfortably in power and say you're spending money and push problems down the road as long as you can and keep them away from you, and without actually caring about getting results, with actually, not taking courageous decisions. And the people said no. It wasn't just about Ukraine, but I think Ukraine actually factored in that a lot. Had Biden been more decisive on Ukraine, well, he was decisive in holding Ukraine back. Had he been decisive in supporting Ukraine and actually getting results and letting all this money and all the money and resources that have been spent, even though it's much less than it really is, than it seems, if he could have reported to the American people, look what we did with our investments. We funded Ukraine, we gave them support. And then Ukrainians created incredible windows of opportunity. They destroyed the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. They, made the incursion into Kursk. And when they did that, we gave them more oxygen to complete the job. We let them hit the Russian missile launch points. And now Ukraine is winning and Moscow is ready to negotiate and surrender. That would have been nice. And the American people probably would have supported that. But so this election showed that accountability does matter, and that So there's a whole other question of like the two-party system and different options available to the Americans. But we do clearly see that the Biden administration was seen to be unfit. And we feel that deeply here with the attacks upon Ukraine. The policy of you can defend yourself, but you can't actually try to win. And so the American people they held the Biden administration accountable as unfit, and I think they will hold. They'll do the same with Trump. But the question here then is, can things actually be really changed here in a transformative way? And I do think I tend to be more of an optimist about, and even Richard Dawkins had a nice tweet about Elon Musk the other day. I tend to, he's an innovator and he's created things, and we have always been controlled by oligarchs in America. Most of our legislation is written by corporations. That's nothing new, and I think that if Elon is serious about this, then let's make the case very strongly. Okay, well, if you're serious about it, then let's examine you say you're going to clean up waste in Washington. Well, the areas where the waste has the most repercussions is on the Ukraine issue, because you say you spend all this money, but for what result? And I think if we really make that case very clearly, Ukraine can be front and center of these efforts to reform Washington, and then we'll very quickly see Washington is serious about it. And that's why I think Trump's selection of Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, the guy he picked for Secretary of Defense is, I don't know, a bit of a wild card, and I'm not sure how serious. But National Security Advisor, as we know from the story of Jake Sullivan, the vizier to the president is very instrumental in shaping policy. And so I think that there's a window of opportunity there, and the more we can make sure Ukraine is included in that part of the story is essential. And I don't know. Jonathan, I firmly believe that if we are to fix things in Washington and America, Ukraine must be central to that necessarily.
And this is an interesting point, isn't it? We'll come to more cabinet appointments in another episode. I think we've just received news of potentially Tulsi Gabbard being appointed to the National Security, but that's a whole other can of worms there, which I think we can park. But what I think is interesting as well, we also saw Russian propagandists this week parading photos of the new First Lady. They've kind of done this before, but in this instance, it seemed to be with an especially, if you can listen to it in Russian and you can look at their faces as they're speaking, it's especially mocking and jeering, it seemed to me, the way they were covering this piece. They could barely cover up their sort of sniggers and laughs while they were doing it. Now, there's two questions that come out of this. One is, will Trump take offense? What will he do if he sees that Russia is not taking him seriously and mocking him? That's a kind of interesting one. But also, it raises a very interesting point, because whether we believe, the disinfo that Russia would like us to believe, which is that Putin is coercively controlling Trump, that they have compromat on him, that he's an asset, he's an agent, all this kind of stuff. And I think they put some of those stories out. That's what they want those in these sort of liberal media to believe, because it gets everybody screaming at each other. It gets everyone shouting and not talking the same language. It's highly effective at doing that. And I think a lot of commentators have fallen hook, line, for sinker for that. It may be, however, that Putin believes he has some way of controlling Trump. Trump may not see the world in exactly the same fashion. So this could be queuing up to quite an interesting confrontation. Trump thinks, that Putin thinks is in control, and Trump may, in a variety of ways, try to demonstrate that that is not the case. And of course, Ukraine is likely to be the instrument of these games between the two of them.
Yeah, as Ukraine has been for so long. I think first in the case of Trump, we can see, I think no matter, let's say even if they did have, the Kremlin had some kind of dirt on him, I don't think it would matter with the Trump supporters. I think Trump has proved that he's, a bit beyond that. Having been shot at a few times, all the convictions, everything else, and he can just bulldoze through that. And so I don't, I think actually with the Kremlin, with their propaganda, and I think this, where you can look at the old KGB idea of reflexive control theory, where you sort of manipulate how people think in a way, almost like Inception. You plant some ideas in their head, and you don't tell them what to think, but you manipulate how they respond to situations. And looking at that, because at first on the face of it, it was very bizarre. Why, many people thought when Trump was elected that Putin would try to be, kissing up to him or applauding him in some ways, and then all of a sudden, sort of in this kind of sense, insulting Trump's wife, but then I was trying to figure out what's going on, and I noticed that the people who were sharing the stories and the images from Russia were Democrats who were pro-Ukraine, and for the first time in 2.5 years, people who are pro-Ukraine are now sharing, and in a sense trusting Russians as a source, and sharing information from Russia because it attacked Trump, and this is what the Kremlin is so good at doing. This is what they did to the American right. Since 2016, and I think very quickly, almost definitely shamelessly, within hours after the American election, they shift from trying to manipulate the American right to manipulate the American left. Because think about it, American conservatives, even in like caricature ways, hated communism, the Kremlin, everything, totalitarian in Russia, like in the Chuck Norris 1980s style, that was still in the memory. And Ronald Reagan, right, of opposing Russia and the Kremlin. How the hell did they become apologists for Russia? And part of it was because Russia, the Kremlin pushed this narrative after 2016 when Democrats would pointing out how Russians were trying to manipulate American elections, and the whole other stories there that we're not going into, but I'm just talking at the macro level. The Democrats were saying Russia manipulated American elections, and the American right, hating the Democrats, took the side of someone you never would have thought they ever would have taken the side of, Russia. And Russia convinced American conservatives, oh, poor little Russia, oh yeah, we're so abused. And so and they got American conservatives to, at first it started with some kind of Russia's not so bad, and then it became even a greater attachment. And I think that's precisely what Russia's now trying to do with the left. This is how they manipulate. Russian propaganda is not simplistic; it's very creative, and it gets into our minds. And just because Russia says something doesn't mean that they have no regard for truth, as we see. Because anyone that had regard for truth would not be destroying, free cities in Ukraine. And so they can say whatever they want with impunity and just mess up our system and thinking. But the fact now that American Democrats, the American people who oppose Trump but support Ukraine, start sharing information from the Kremlin has created a relationship with them. And that's what the Kremlin wants. And they're feeding them stories. And that's why I really think that for all of our differences in America between Republicans and Democrats and Trump and anti-Trump and everything, like we should all be united in never sharing, never taking seriously anything that comes from the Kremlin, because its only goal is to destroy us. And we can have all of our vehement arguments amongst each other, but the Kremlin. And so I think with this Melania Trump story, it was not about. Everyone says that's what everyone says. Everyone says, oh, they're trying to get to Trump. I mean, if they are, it's a stupid strategy, because I don't see that would even matter one way or the other. He might be proud of it, So
was a friend of mine, a Ukrainian friend of mine, said that. She said, "Well, hang on a second. Would Trump necessarily take offense to this? He might just point it and go, 'She's beautiful, isn't she? She's mine, right?' And turn it around into a boast of some kind."
Yeah. I think it's the Kremlin trying, and I think in some sense of desperation, maybe, but trying to manipulate us and to get because let's say that Trump is getting people who are more serious about victory, either like, let's get this done or let's not do it at all. Then maybe the Kremlin would be afraid, and maybe they want to undermine him. And now maybe they want to get the people who heretofore had supported Ukraine, for example, all the pro-Ukraine people who were on Twitter or X, who've now left because they're angry. Well, now they've taken their voice away from this, and they just give up. And the Kremlin says this is an opportunity. So okay, let's undermine. And I think this is the other Kremlin propaganda topic that's come up. We had stories a few days ago. It was mainly in the UK press about the nuclear concerns from 2022, and the headlines. If a headline says nuclear, it doesn't matter any of the details. It's enough to put in people's mind, oh shit, it's nuclear. We should be afraid. And all these headlines in the past days, originating in the UK, talked about in 2022, Washington and London were concerned that there was a 50-50 chance that Putin was going to, go nuclear. And part of this was the government of Liz Truss. Do you remember that name? She was the prime minister of the United Kingdom for, less than the lifespan of a piece of lettuce, a head of lettuce. And so, but all that's forgotten, and the stories are like with great gravitas saying, the UK was terrified of Putin was going to go nuclear, and Liz Truss dispatched was it Ben Wallace to Washington, and two things about this. One, none of those stories mention what happened. They don't mention that there was no nuclear attack. They don't mention that Ukraine kept crossing so-called Russian red lines many times in extraordinary ways, including when Washington did get permission for Ukraine to use American HIMARS to hit Russia in a limited way, and then entering Russian territory, and no nuclear response whatsoever. In fact, Russia has never, every single time Ukraine has what some people will call escalated, Ukraine has done something very bold. Russia has never met that, ever. I just saw a report from the BBC from 2023 saying, everyone's nervous because Ukraine had just done something bold in the Black Sea or somewhere. And the BBC reporter, I forget his name right now, he said, there's great fear that Russia's going to retaliate. And that's always the story. But there's no retaliation. And then the press doesn't cover the fact that there was no retaliation because it's so hard to get the absence.
And they always call it escalation. They don't ever call it defense. It's always escalate. Ukraine has escalated. So they almost subconsciously, or even starting to fear consciously, fall into this language. And it points to an unfortunate, both conscious and unconscious decision. And I think this is one of the real reasons why, in the end, it is rumored that relationships between Kyiv and Washington started to break down. It's also been said that the relationship between Kyiv and the current UK government is also not going in the right direction. And that is because London is very much tapped into a kind of consensus type politics with the US, following the US's lead, no longer leading from the front as we were at the early stages of the war, not showing the way by providing new capabilities, always being in that sort of follower position. And of course, the frustrations of Kyiv have completely, I think, boiled over and even started to sort of show in public. But in private, it suggested the relationship was extremely fractured. So I can appreciate what you say about, seeing the back of Jake Sullivan. People must be thinking it cannot be worse than what was happening and the direction in which things were going. It also talks to the idea, and this is unfortunately imbued in many areas that we see, whether it's academia, media, or politics, that Ukraine has been treated as a second-tier ally. Russia is still, despite it being a mafia gas station with an economy a fraction of the size of even individual members of the EU, let alone the combined bloc, it is still seen as a first-tier adversary. How do we overcome that? Because, people like yourself who are familiar with Ukrainians, with their bravery, with their extraordinary innovation, would in no way see them as second-tier in anything.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, we just need more honest storytelling and reporting, and we need people who are decision makers to visit here to understand the situation. I mean, like, for example, look at the stories in the past couple of days of Russians. There's a butter problem in Russia, a butter shortage, and there's many reports of butter heist, people stealing butter because it's hard to find it, and it's on the black market. And we've two different butter stories. We have that in Russia, that the people are stealing butter, and then in the United States, Costco, which is like the big kind of like Walmart in America, and they have a butter recall because someone forgot to put in a label of butter that is made from cows. Now, this might sound crazy, but it's relevant here to Ukraine on two different ways. One, Ukraine is a nation that is under daily missile and drone attack. It's a nation with it's young men are losing their lives every single day at the front lines, lives and limbs, and there's no butter shortage here. There's no toilet paper shortage here. It's a society that knows how to function. Outside of Russian missile and drone attacks, these cities are safe. There's no crime. There's not murders. It's a very safe, lovely place. Look at what happened in Amsterdam with the attacks, for example, on the Jewish people, the Israeli fans in Amsterdam. When there's no Russian missile attack, Ukraine is one of the safest countries for a Jew in Europe because there's tolerance here, and it's a strong, peaceful society. And then look at the American side, where like Americans are panicking over like butter, which everyone should know it comes from a cow, is being recalled from one of the biggest chain stores in America because I forgot to tell you that. And like Ukrainians, that would never happen here. Ukrainians know how to survive. They know like the fundamentals of, they know the butter comes from a cow. And so Ukraine is an example of actually a really healthy, functioning society. I look at, how Trump is, named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. As his health czar to get rid of chemicals in our foods. Ukrainians don't have all those chemicals in their food. Organic food here is what you buy from the market or from the babushka on the sidewalk. It's natural and part of it. Ukrainians, for Americans, Ukrainians have so many of the solutions that Americans are looking for are here, but it's on the edge of being erased by missiles and drones from Russia. And the fact that Russia is a country that does not very rarely, like the Ukrainians had a little bit of a drone attack on Moscow a few days ago, but usually there's no, you're in Russia, a Russian city, there's no missiles or drones falling on your head, and yet they can't get butter. But Ukraine is on the edge of dying, and it's a land of plenty even then. And I think if we can get Americans to see that, I think that will really. There's just a few mental blinders we have to get rid of, and once people see this, they will believe in Ukraine. And Jonathan, there was I don't know if maybe I told you this before, but there was official from Washington, a think tank defense policy expert who likely will work in the Trump White House, secretly came here to Ukraine a month ago and traveled the country. He was nearby some terrible attacks. And when he left Ukraine, I said, "What's your biggest impression?" And he works for one of the most prominent think tanks. Well, we won't name it, but in Washington. And he has all the resources to find out the truth on hand. And he said, in Washington, I thought of this war as a contest between the Zelenskyy government and the Kremlin. And he said, I was amazed, Joe. He said, every single person I met in Ukraine, taxi drivers, baristas, IT people, everything, they all wanted to win. There was a whole society that had not given up. And if Americans can see that, including the people close to Trump, I think Ukraine has a big chance.
This is something I think we need to pick up in our next conversation, because Trump hates losers, or what he labels as losers. He loves winners, or he loves the idea of winning. He loves to bask in the glory of a win. He likes to appropriate, let's say, that sense of winning and put his own little brand on it. And that's fair enough. That's fine. I don't care if he wants to call it a win and he pulled it off in Ukraine, then quite happy to give him that. But that's something we need to focus on, which is creating opportunities or stories that convince Trump and his circle they can gain a win from supporting Ukraine. And then if they support Russia, this will only tar them in the short term, the medium term, the long term, and in the history books as losers. And I think we can tell stories that ladder up to that. Before we sign off, is there a last word you want on that? Maybe cue up the next episode and how we can sort of create wins, create stories about winning for Trump and convince him that Ukrainians are those winners.
Yeah, indeed, Jonathan. I think, it's not just about showing that, America can help a country standing for its freedom. It's not just about the great mineral resources of Ukraine, which, by the way, if Russia were to control all of Donbass, Russia and China would control all the key ingredients for semiconductors, by the way, which should put us at a big disadvantage. But so all those are very practical benefits for America, but it's not just about that. I think Ukraine actually can show, if we're serious about transforming Washington and making government really, again, of the people, not about some corrupt boondoggle that the elections are just a show, and the powerful people throw money at problems just so they can stay in power. If we're really serious about cleaning up Washington and making government efficient and honest and for the people, then Ukraine is the way to fix it, because Ukraine can show is the best prison to show the bullshit from Washington. I mean, we see it all. As long as it takes, we stand with you, Ukraine. We throw money at it and doing nothing to actually get a solution. And if we can solve Ukraine, I think every other thing becomes solvable, including the border and everything else. And so I think that there's actually a very tangible, practical benefit of Ukraine to fixing America, to fixing Washington, and it has to start with Ukraine. So.
That's a great place to end, and it's a good place to pick up on our next conversation. Joe, stay safe. Thank you for everything you do. It's in these dark times, it's good to tap into your optimism as well. We certainly need a little bit of that, but I think the audience will appreciate that as well, and the stories you bring from Ukraine.
Jonathan, thank you. You can follow my stories every day at JP Lindsley on Twitter, X, Instagram, YouTube, and UkrainianFreedomNews.com. Thanks.